We'd been married for 7 years, and life had settled into a routine. We had 2 kids, a 6-year-old son and a 4-year-old daughter, who kept us busy. I thought everything was fine. That day, though, would flip my world upside down. It started when I came home from work earlier than usual, 2 hours ahead of schedule. It wasn't planned. I'd wrapped up a project faster than expected and decided to surprise my wife. It was already dark outside when I pulled into the driveway. When I reached the front door, something odd caught my attention. The door was locked. That wasn't unusual on its own, but as I put my key in, I realized it wasn't just locked, it was bolted from the inside. A wave of confusion hit me. Why would she bolt the door with me on the way home? I walked around the house to the back door, hoping it might be open, but it was locked too. The house was completely dark, no lights on in the windows. I started knocking on the glass panes, calling out her name. "Hey, it's me. Open up." But the house stayed silent. The silence pressed against me, heavy and unnerving. I leaned against the windows, trying to see if anyone was inside. At first, I saw nothing but shadows, the faint outlines of furniture. Then something moved. 2 dark silhouettes flashed across my line of sight, disappearing as quickly as they'd appeared. Who else was in my house? I pulled out my phone and called my wife. The line rang until her voicemail picked up. I tried again. Nothing. I even dialed the landline, a number we barely used anymore, but it rang out unanswered. I climbed back into my car and parked it where I could watch the house. If someone was inside, I wasn't leaving until I got answers. For an hour, I sat there, the silence between each failed call to my wife growing louder in my head. No one came out of the house. No lights turned on. Nothing. Just as frustration was boiling over, headlights appeared in my rearview mirror. My dad's car pulled up behind mine, and my kids jumped out of the back seat, excited to see me. I wasn't sure if I felt relief or something heavier. My dad had taken the kids for the day to give my wife and me a break. Now he was bringing them back, and I had to figure out how to handle this without them getting caught in the middle. I met him halfway, keeping my voice low so the kids wouldn't hear. "Something's wrong," I said. "The house is locked up, and she's not answering her phone. I saw someone inside." I left it at that. My dad's face tightened, and he nodded. He ushered the kids back into his car and came with me to the front door. While he knocked on the back windows and doors, I pounded on the front door, my voice firm and loud. "Open the door." My patience was gone. I was done waiting. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a light flickered on inside. The door creaked open, and there she was, standing in front of me. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, like she'd been caught in the middle of something. I turned to my dad. "Take the kids back to the car," I said. He didn't argue, just nodded and left. Once they were safely out of earshot, I stepped inside and shut the door behind me. What happened next took the ground out from under me. I could not have imagined such a thing. She stood in the doorway, wrapped in her housecoat, hair messy like she'd just rolled out of bed. Her hand went up to cover a yawn, but something about it didn't sit right. It wasn't natural. More like a performance, forced and deliberate, as if she was trying to sell the idea that she'd been asleep. I didn't waste time. Why was the door locked from the inside? My voice was steady, sharper than I intended, but I wasn't in the mood for games. Her response came quickly, too quickly. I must have accidentally put the lock on the safety. She shrugged, like it was no big deal. I crossed my arms, staring at her. "You didn't hear me knocking? Calling? For an hour." She blinked, then offered a weak smile. "I was asleep. I didn't hear anything." It was a lie. It had to be. There was no way she hadn't heard me banging on windows, pounding on doors, yelling her name. The house was too small, the noise too loud. I narrowed my eyes. "Who else is here?" That's when her expression changed. For a split second, her face twisted, fear flashing across her features, but she quickly covered it with a laugh. What? That's nonsense. There's no one else here. I stepped closer, my voice calm but firm. Don't lie to me. I saw someone. 2 silhouettes. Through the window. Her face drained of color, pale as a sheet, before a deep flush spread across her cheeks. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. That reaction told me everything I needed to know. I didn't wait for another excuse. I walked past her, heading straight for the kitchen. There was a small ladder that led down to the basement. It wasn't a big space, just a utility area we rarely used, but the thought had already struck me. I wasn't about to waste time searching the other rooms. She followed me, her voice pitching higher. What are you doing? There's no one here. You're being ridiculous. I ignored her, grabbing the ladder and yanking it down. The faint creak of the hinges filled the air as I unfolded it and turned on the basement light. And there he was. He stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, a man I'd never seen before. His face was a mix of shame and fear, his hands shoved awkwardly into his pockets like he didn't know what else to do. I pointed at him. Get out, I said, my tone cold and unwavering. Get out of my house. Now. He didn't argue. He didn't say a word. He just climbed up the ladder and walked past me, head down, avoiding my gaze. I watched as he slipped out the front door and disappeared into the night. I turned to her. She was standing there, her mouth moving like she wanted to say something, but all that came out were fragments of excuses. It's not what it looks like. He was just. I didn't mean. Stop, I cut her off, my voice sharp. Don't lie to me. Not now. Her eyes filled with tears, but they didn't move me. The lies were too obvious, the betrayal too raw. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on, but I didn't back down. But all this was only the beginning. What I learned next did not fit in my head. She crumpled in front of me, tears spilling down her cheeks, her hands shaking as she blurted out, "Nothing happened. I swear, nothing happened between us." Her words tumbled over one another in a rush, as though if she spoke fast enough, I wouldn't have time to process what she was saying. He's just an old acquaintance, someone I knew from college. That's all. He just came by to visit, to catch up. I stood there, arms crossed, staring at her with the kind of silence that made her squirm. Her face twisted with desperation, like she knew her story wasn't convincing but hoped I'd be too tired or too distracted to call her out. I let her keep talking. Sometimes silence is the best weapon. He didn't even stay long, she added quickly, as if that would make it better. He just stopped by to say hello. It's nothing. It's not what you think. Finally, I spoke, my voice calm but cutting. And you greet old acquaintances in a bathrobe? In the dark. With the doors locked from the inside. Her response was immediate, like she'd rehearsed it in her head during those moments she'd been stalling. I didn't know you'd be home so early. You weren't supposed to be here for hours. I just panicked. I was afraid you'd think the worst. I raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. You thought I'd think the worst, so you bolted the doors and ignored me knocking for an hour? That's the story you're sticking with. Her mouth opened, then closed again. She sank onto the couch in the living room, burying her face in her hands. Her shoulders trembled as she sobbed, her words muffled by her fingers. You don't understand, she said. You're twisting everything. It's not like that. I didn't move. I just watched her, waiting for her to look up at me. Her robe shifted slightly as she adjusted her position, and that's when I saw it, a glimpse of her bare skin underneath. She wasn't wearing anything under the robe. The realization hit me like a brick. I stood there, frozen for a moment, my thoughts racing. Her tearful explanations, the rushed excuses, the bolted doors, all of it clicked into place. You were afraid I'd think the worst, I said slowly, my voice steady. But you're sitting here, crying about your innocence, wearing nothing but a bathrobe. Am I supposed to believe that? Her face turned crimson as she clutched the robe tightly around herself, covering the exposed skin. "I just got out of the shower," she cried. "I didn't have time to get dressed." He showed up unannounced. I didn't even know he was coming. The excuses kept coming, one after another, each one weaker than the last. I leaned against the wall, crossing my arms. "And this old friend of yours, who you haven't seen in how many years, thought it was perfectly fine to show up at our house unannounced? While your husband wasn't home. And you decided to entertain him like this." I gestured toward her robe. "Does that sound normal to you?" Her lips trembled as she wiped at her face with shaky hands. "You're twisting this," she said again, her voice breaking. "It's not fair. You're making it sound like I did something wrong when I didn't." I stayed silent for a moment, letting the weight of my words settle in the air between us. Then I said, "Do you really think that excuse holds up? Do you think I'm an idiot?" Her tears came harder now, her shoulders shaking as she tried to compose herself. "He's just a friend," she whispered, almost to herself. "You're blowing this out of proportion." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. My silence was louder than anything I could have said. The seconds ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last. She looked up at me, her eyes pleading, as though she still thought there was a chance to salvage this. But I could see the guilt in her face, the cracks in her facade. Finally, she shifted her tone, desperation seeping into her voice. "I didn't ask him to come," she said, her words quick and frantic. "He just showed up. I wasn't expecting him. What was I supposed to do? Tell him to leave? I didn't want to be rude." I couldn't help but let out a bitter laugh. "Rude? You didn't want to be rude to him, but you're fine lying to me? Locking me out of my own house while you entertain him? In a bathrobe?" She flinched, her hands clenching the fabric of the robe tighter around her body. "It's not what it looks like," she insisted. "I swear, I didn't do anything wrong." "Didn't do anything wrong?" I repeated, my voice rising slightly. "You expect me to believe that? After everything I've seen tonight? You really think I'm that stupid?" Her tears fell harder, but they didn't move me. Not this time. I'd always been the one to forgive, to give her the benefit of the doubt, but this was different. The lies were too obvious, the betrayal too blatant. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Her excuses were running dry, her desperation clear in her wide, tear-filled eyes. But all this, as it turned out later, was just her acting. I didn't say much after her last excuse. I didn't need to. The weight of what had happened spoke louder than anything I could say in that moment. I turned and headed toward our bedroom. She followed behind me, pleading, her voice breaking with every step. "Please don't go," she begged, her words tangled with sobs. "We can talk about this. It's not what you think." I didn't stop. I grabbed a bag from the closet, threw in some clothes for myself, and zipped it shut. My movements were steady, deliberate. I wasn't going to lose my composure, not in front of her. "I'm going to stay at my parents' place tonight," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I need time to think about this." She stepped closer, reaching out to touch my arm, but I pulled away. "Don't do this," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Don't leave. We can work through this. Please." I turned to face her, meeting her tear-filled eyes with a steady gaze. "You should have thought about that before you invited him into our home." Her knees buckled slightly, and she sank onto the edge of the bed, sobbing into her hands. I walked out of the room without looking back, grabbed my bag, and went to the car where my father and the kids were waiting. When I got in, my father gave me a questioning look, but I just shook my head. "Let's go," I said. The kids didn't seem to notice anything was wrong, happily chatting about their day with Grandpa as we drove to my parents' house. But the tension in the air was impossible for me to ignore. My father didn't push me for answers, but I could tell he wanted to. When we arrived, my mom was surprised to see us. "What's going on?" she asked as we stepped inside. I'll explain later, I said, forcing a smile for the kids' sake. We'll be staying here for a little while. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, the scene replayed in my mind: the bolted doors, the man in the basement, her robe, and the lies. The next morning, I knew I'd need more things for myself and the kids. I told my parents I was going back to the house to grab what we needed. My father offered to come with me, but I told him to stay with the kids. When I got to the house, it felt empty, hollow. She was at work, so there was no one to stop me from gathering what I needed. But every corner of the house felt tainted, like the betrayal had seeped into the walls. I packed more clothes, grabbed some toys for the kids, and returned to my parents' place. The kids asked why we weren't going home, their innocent questions tugging at my heart. "Why are we still here?" my son asked, looking up at me with wide eyes. I forced a smile. "We're just spending some extra time with Grandma and Grandpa," I said, hoping he wouldn't see through the lie. 2 weeks passed like this. During that time, she came to my parents' house several times, knocking on the door and begging to talk. I didn't let her in. One evening, she stayed outside for nearly an hour, her voice cracking as she pleaded. "Please," she said, "just let me explain. Let me make this right." I stayed silent, sitting on the couch and staring at the door. My mom offered to send her away, but I shook my head. "She'll leave eventually," I said. And she did. But then her mother showed up. She wasn't as patient. She banged on the door, her voice sharp and unrelenting. "You can't just walk away like this," she shouted. "You have children. They need both their parents." I opened the door just enough to meet her eyes. "Your daughter should have thought of that before she did what she did," I said, my voice even. "If you want to talk about what's best for my kids, start with her." Her face twisted with indignation, but she had no response. After a moment, she turned and left without another word. That was the moment I knew there was no going back. I contacted a lawyer and started the process of filing for divorce. But there was a problem. I needed documents from the house to finalize the filing. When I returned to the house, she wasn't there, likely at work. But I did confront her and she exposed herself, but more on that later. I arrived back at the house with a clear purpose: to pack the last of my things and find the documents I needed for the lawyer. I wanted to be in and out quickly, but things didn't go as planned. The first stop was the closet in the office, where we always kept important papers. I opened the drawers and went through the files methodically, but the documents weren't there. Not the marriage certificate, not the financial records, none of it. Either she had moved them or taken them altogether. I sighed, frustrated, and started searching through the rest of the house. The bedroom, the kitchen, even the kids' rooms. I looked everywhere, but there was no sign of the papers. I had just started going through the cabinets in the living room when I heard the sound of her car pulling into the driveway. I froze for a moment, then steadied myself. I wasn't going to leave until I found what I came for. The door opened, and she stepped inside. She must have seen my car parked out front, but the sight of me standing there seemed to shake her anyway. She dropped her bag and rushed toward me, tears already streaming down her face. "Please," she cried, her voice breaking, "please don't do this. Don't leave. We can fix this." I turned to face her, standing tall. "I'm filing for divorce," I said calmly. "And the kids will stay with me." Her face changed instantly. The sorrow was gone, replaced by anger. Her tears dried up as if they'd never been there in the first place. "Divorce," she spat. "You're going to file for divorce and take the kids? Over this? After everything I've put up with from you?" I raised an eyebrow. "Everything you've put up with?" She crossed her arms and stepped closer, her voice rising. "Yes, everything I've put up with. You're always working late, always putting your job first. You're the one who left me feeling ignored and lonely. What was I supposed to do? Sit around and wait for you to remember you had a wife?" I didn't flinch. "So you're saying this is my fault?" She nodded, Her anger building. Yes. If you'd been there for me, if you'd made me feel like I mattered, I wouldn't have needed to reach out to an old friend. He was there for me when you weren't. I stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. She had just admitted it, without even realizing what she'd done. She didn't say how long it had been going on, but it didn't matter. My suspicions were confirmed. I took a step back, shaking my head. Do you even hear yourself right now? I asked. You're blaming me for your choices. You could have talked to me, told me how you were feeling, but instead, you let him into our house. You lied to me. And now you're trying to justify it. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For a moment, her anger faltered, and she looked lost, like she didn't know what to say next. I didn't wait for her to find the words. This is on you, I said, my voice firm. Not me. I turned back to the cabinet and resumed my search for the documents. She stayed in the room, silent now, watching me as I moved from drawer to drawer. Finally, I found them tucked away in a box in the corner of the room. I grabbed them, put them in my bag, and stood up straight. The lawyer is already working on the paperwork, I said as I slung the bag over my shoulder. She didn't say anything as I walked toward the door. When I reached it, I turned back one last time. I hope, for the kid's sake, you can take some responsibility for what you've done. Then I left. Now, as I sit here waiting for the divorce papers to be finalized, I can't help but wonder. Do you think I did the right thing? Share your thoughts in the comments below this video.